Welcome back to the deep dive, where we cut through the noise and get straight to the knowledge that helps you connect the dots. Imagine for a moment a baby gazelle, born just minutes ago, struggling to its feet. Within half an hour, it's running at 20 miles per hour, making these life-or-death decisions without anyone explicitly telling it how. Or think about a seasoned chess player, not following a script, but honing this incredible intuition over countless games, constantly adapting. How do they learn to make the best decisions in a completely new, uncertain environment with basically no instruction manual, just feedback?
Yeah,
That, right there, is the core challenge reinforcement learning is designed to tackle.
exactly. And today, we're taking a deep dive into reinforcement learning, or RL. We're not just going to touch the surface. We're going to explore what it is, how it works, and really build a foundational understanding from the ground up. Our mission for you, our listener, is to demystify RL, providing crystal clear definitions, practical, sticky examples, and those aha moments that, transform complex ideas into intuitive understanding.
Right. And for this journey, we're primarily drawing from reinforcement learning. An introduction by Richard Sutton and Andrew Bardo, which is, it's widely considered the definitive text in the field.
It really is the Bible of RL.
Totally. We'll be unpacking key concepts like the multi-armed bandit problem, Markov decision processes, value functions, and temporal difference learning. Think of this as constructing a solid, beginner-friendly framework that will serve you incredibly well in understanding this cutting-edge field.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll possess a robust conceptual framework for understanding how intelligent agents learn to make optimal decisions in uncertain dynamic environments. You'll grasp why this field is so crucial for everything from cutting-edge robotics to advanced game AI, and maybe even gain a new lens through which to view aspects of biological learning. It's about more than just technology. It's really about fundamental principles of intelligence and learning itself. #tag what is reinforcement learning, a new way to learn.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. When we talk about reinforcement learning, what exactly are we talking about? Because it's often thrown around as just another machine learning technique, but our source material makes it clear it's much more than that, right?
That's a great starting point because it really is a unique paradigm. Reinforcement learning is simultaneously a fundamental problem, the problem of learning to act optimally in an environment to maximize a reward. It's also a class of solution methods that tackle that problem effectively, and, well, it's an entire field of study dedicated to understanding these challenges and solutions. At its heart, it's about an agent learning what to do, how to map the situations it perceives to the actions it can take, all with the singular goal of maximizing a numerical reward signal it receives from its environment.
So it's not just about predicting something or classifying data. It sounds like the agent is actively making decisions and influencing its own future.
Precisely. And that's the crucial differentiator.
Yeah.
RL problems are inherently closed loop,
Closed loop.
meaning the agent's actions don't just produce an output, they directly influence its future inputs or what it perceives next. Imagine a robot exploring a new room. Its decision to move left or right changes the next sensor readings it receives.
Got it.
Unlike, say, supervised learning, where an agent is explicitly told the right answer for a given input, in RL, the agent isn't given direct instructions on what actions to take. It has to discover what works through a process of trial and error.
Okay, trial and error.
And, to complicate matters further, the consequences of its actions, including those crucial reward signals, often play out over extended time periods. They can be delayed.
Right. Delayed consequences. That sounds tricky.
It is. This trio of characteristics being closed loop, requiring discovery through trial and error, and dealing with delayed consequences, truly distinguishes reinforcement learning from other paradigms of machine learning. The key insight here is that RL fundamentally tackles problems, where the learning itself changes the problem, making it a truly active, interactive form of intelligence.
So if we're imagining an intelligent system trying to achieve some goal in this interactive way, what are the fundamental pieces we absolutely need? Our source mentions sensation, action, and goal as the simplest core aspects. But let's break that down even further into the main essential elements of any RL system to really understand how they interact.
Right, let's lay out the groundwork. At the core, we have two interacting entities. First, the agent. This is the learner and the decision maker. It's the part of the system that observes and acts.
The learner.
Second, its environment. This is everything outside the agent that it interacts with. This includes the physical world, other agents, the rules of a game, basically. Anything the agent cannot arbitrarily change.
Everything else.
Exactly. These two interact at discrete time steps. At each step, The agent receives a representation of the environment's current state, which is its perception of the situation. Based on this state, it selects an action from a set of available options. One time step later, as a consequence of that action, the environment provides the agent with a numerical reward, just a single number, positive for good, negative for bad, and transitions to a new state.
State, action, reward, new state. That's the loop.
That's the loop. And this cycle then repeats. The agent's brain, or its strategy for choosing actions, is called its policy. This policy dictates how it maps observed states to actions.
Okay, the policy is the strategy and the reward.
Yeah.
You mentioned it's crucial. It's what you want, not how to get it. Can you give us another example of how getting the reward wrong could lead to, well, problems?
Absolutely. The reward signal is paramount. It's the single most important definition of the problem. It defines what you want the agent to accomplish, not how to achieve it. Imagine you're training a robot to clean a room. If you reward it just for moving dirt around.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
Right. It might just sweep dirt into a pile and declare victory, or even kick dirt around to maximize its reward score, rather than actually cleaning.
So it games the system.
Exactly. But if you reward it for the absence of dirt in specified areas, it's forced to figure out a path that leads to a truly clean room, even if that means picking up dirt and disposing of it properly. The reward signal is your direct, unambiguous communication of the ultimate objective.
That's a really clear distinction. So it's not just about learning, it's about active, adaptive learning in a changing world. How is this fundamentally different from other types of machine learning we might have heard of, like supervised or unsupervised learning? Because on the surface, they all sound like learning from data, but the mechanisms seem quite distinct.
They really are distinct. In supervised learning, you essentially have a teacher. You provide the system with a data set of inputs, and for each input, you tell it the correct output or label.
Like image classification, this is a cat, this is a dog.
Exactly. The system learns to map inputs to outputs. Think of training a spam filter with emails already labeled spam or not spam. Unsupervised learning, on the other hand, deals with unlabeled data. There's no teacher. The system's job is to find hidden structures or patterns within the data itself, like clustering customers into different segments without any prior examples of those segments.
Finding patterns, okay.
Reinforcement learning, however, stands apart because it's fundamentally about goal-directed interaction with an uncertain environment. The agent learns through direct experience and feedback, those rewards, not from explicit labels or by simply finding patterns. It's holistic, considering the full problem of an agent pursuing a goal in an interactive setting, rather than just isolated subproblems. This trial-and-error closed-loop feedback mechanism is much closer to how humans and animals learn complex skills.
Like a child learning to ride a bike, maybe? Or an animal foraging for food?
Precisely those kinds of things. It's learning by doing, essentially.
So the idea of an agent learning through feedback isn't new, but this field feels like it's seen a huge resurgence recently. Our source material tells us there are deep roots, tracing back through several scientific disciplines before coalescing into the modern field we know today. What are some of those historical threads?
Oh, the history of RL is fascinating, truly splitting into two main distinct threads that were pursued independently for a long, long time before they really intertwined. On one side, we had animal psychology, focusing on how animals learn through trial and error. This goes back to figures like Edward Thorndike with his famous law of effect from way back in 1911.
The law of effect. Remind me.
It basically states that actions followed by satisfaction are more likely to recur, while those followed by discomfort are less likely to recur. Simple, but profound.
Animal psychology, that makes perfect sense for the term reinforcement, like Pavlov's dogs, but maybe more about active choices. What was some of the earliest AI thinking influenced by this?
Exactly. This idea profoundly influenced early thoughts in artificial intelligence. People like Alan Turing, back in 1948, described a kind of pleasure pain system that clearly echoed Thorndike's principle. Then there was what Marvin Minsky later called the credit assignment problem, which is a really crucial puzzle.
Credit assignment problem, that sounds fundamental. How do you know which action in a long chain actually led to a good or bad outcome? It can't just be the very last thing you did.
You've nailed it. That's the core issue. If you make 20 moves in a chess game and then you win, how do you know which of those 20 moves were the good ones, the critical ones, and which were maybe less good, or even mistakes that were overcome later? It's all about distributing credit or blame across a sequence of decisions. A fantastic early example, though quite simple, was Donald Michie's tic-tac-toe playing machine called Menace. from the early 1960s. It literally used matchboxes and colored beads.
Matchboxes and beads, seriously.
Seriously. Each matchbox represented a possible game state, and the beads inside represented the possible moves from that state. If a move led to a win, more beads of that color were added to the box. If it led to a loss, beads were removed.
Wow.
It was a physical, hands-on demonstration of trial and error learning, tackling that credit assignment problem in a very rudimentary but effective way.
So that's one thread. Learning from experience, feedback, trial and error, credit assignment. What was the other major path?
The second major thread comes from optimal control and dynamic programming. This field, rooted more in mathematics and engineering, focused on solving complex decision problems mathematically. Think of it as planning optimal actions by calculating values for all possible future states, but crucially, assuming you have a perfect mathematical model of the world.
So less about learning from scratch, more about planning with perfect information.
It's exactly. Key figures here include Richard Bellman, who introduced dynamic programming and Markov decision processes, or MDPs, which we'll talk about soon in the 1950s, and Ronald Howard, who devised the policy iteration method for MDPs in 1960. For the most part, this thread didn't involve learning in the sense of trial and error. It was about computation and optimization using a known model.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that these two distinct paths, the psychological focus on learning through interaction and the mathematical focus on optimal control, largely converged in the late 1980s to form modern reinforcement learning. And there was a third, maybe less distinct thread involving temporal difference methods, which we'll definitely get into later. They acted as a crucial bridge, particularly in problems like that early tic-tac-toe example, by allowing learning from differences between successive predictions, kind of blending the planning and learning aspects.
That's a fantastic overview of the foundations. Now, one of the biggest challenges in RL right from the start is this fundamental trade-off, exploration versus exploitation. Our source introduces it beautifully with what's known as the N-armed bandit problem. This isn't just some academic exercise. It really captures a core dilemma faced by any learning agent, or even us, in everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think about trying a new restaurant versus sticking with your tried and true favorite. That's the trade-off right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine you walk into a casino and see a row of slot machines that they call one-armed bandits. But this time, there are N levers you can pull. Each lever gives you a different random reward when pulled, drawn from some probability distribution specific to that lever. But here's the catch. You don't know in advance which one is the most generous, which one has the highest average payout.
Right, you have no prior information.
Your goal is to maximize your total winnings over, say, 1,000 pulls. This is the essence of the N-armed bandit problem. The dilemma is stark. Do you exploit what you already know? Meaning, you keep pulling the lever that has given you the most reward so far because it seems to be the best based on your limited experience.
Stick with the winner.
Or do you explore? Meaning, you try out a new lever, one you haven't pulled much or at all, to see if it might be even better, even though trying it might mean sacrificing some immediate reward you could have gotten from your current favorite lever.
Risking short-term gain for potentially greater long-term gain.
Precisely. Neither strategy can be pursued exclusively without failing at the task. If you only exploit, you might get stuck on a suboptimal lever forever, never discovering the truly best one.
You never learn.
Right. And if you only explore, you'll try everything, but never settle on the best one to actually maximize your winnings. It's a delicate balance.
You mentioned the source gives a real-world example involving doctors.
Yes. The book uses the example of a doctor choosing between several experimental treatments for a series of patients with the same condition. Each patient is like a pull of the bandit arm. The doctor wants to cure as many patients as possible, maximize reward. Do they stick with the treatment that seems to be working best so far, exploit, or try a different one on the next patient to gather more information about its effectiveness? It's a very real-world, high-stakes version of the same exploration-exploitation dilemma.
That really hits home. So, to navigate this tricky situation, we need a way to quantify what makes one action or one lever better than another. How do we put a number on that goodness?
To do that, we assign an expected or mean reward to each action, which we call its action value, often denoted as QA for action A. If you magically knew the true action value of each lever with certainty, then the problem would be trivial.
Yeah, you just pull the best one every time.
Exactly. You would always pick the one with the highest value that's the greedy action. When you select a greedy action, you are exploiting your current knowledge. However, the core of the bandit problem is that you don't know these true values. You only have estimates based on the pulls you've made so far. We often denote the estimate at time step 2 as QTA.
So your estimates get better over time as you pull more levers.
Hopefully, that's the idea. The challenge becomes how to act optimally or near optimally when your knowledge is imperfect and uncertain, and you need to use your actions to both gain information and maximize rewards.
So how do we navigate this delicate dance between trying new things and sticking with what seems to work? The source provides some wonderfully simple yet incredibly effective methods for managing this exploration-exploitation trade-off. Let's dig into some of those strategies.
Right, let's look at a few common ones. These are often illustrated using simulations, like what the book calls a 10-armed test bed, where they run experiments over many different bandit problems to get reliable average performance curves. First, we have greedy methods. This is perhaps the simplest and most common approach.
Epsilon greedy. Okay.
Most of the time, with a probability of 1SU exploit. You choose the action that currently has the highest estimated value, your current best guess, the greedy action. But with a small probability, epsilon, you explore. You choose one of the other actions randomly with equal probability.
So mostly greedy, but occasionally take a random punt.
Exactly. Our source's 10-armed test bed experiment clearly illustrates this. A purely greedy method where S0 improved quickly at the very start but then leveled off at a much lower performance. It often got stuck pulling a suboptimal lever.
Because it never explored enough to find the true best one.
Right. In contrast, even a small amount of exploration like setting fibmo 0.1 explore 10% of the time or 0.01 explore 1% of the time led to much better long-term performance. Interestingly, the Aner 0.1 method explores more, so it finds the optimal action earlier. But because it keeps exploring 10% of the time, it doesn't always pick the best action even after finding it. The Eta 0.01 method improves slower, but eventually outperforms the Eta 0.1 method because it exploits the best action more consistently once found.
So there's a trade-off even within epsilon greedy.
Yes, and often we use a constant step size parameter, A, for updating the estimates. This is important because it gives more weight to recent rewards, which helps if the actual reward probabilities are changing over time, what we call a non-stationary environment.
That makes sense. A little bit of randomness can prevent you from getting stuck, and weighting recent rewards helps adapt. What about other clever ways to encourage exploration?
Another neat approach is optimistic initial values. This is a clever psychological trick, in a way.
How does that work?
Instead of starting your action value estimates at 0 or some other neutral value, you initialize them optimistically high, much higher than any reward you actually expect to receive.
So you pretend all the levers are amazing at the start.
Kind of. Because the agent's goal is to maximize reward, and it thinks all actions are initially great, it will naturally be driven to try every action at least once, just to see if its overly optimistic initial estimate holds true. Every time it pulls the lever and gets a reward lower than its initial optimistic estimate, the estimate for that lever goes down. It's essentially driven by disappointment to keep trying new things until its high initial estimates are corrected by actual experience. This forces broad exploration early on without needing a separate random exploration parameter like iframet.
So it's like setting unrealistic expectations forces you to explore reality. That's quite clever. What if we want a more strategic exploration rather than just random or disappointment-driven?
For more strategic exploration, we have upper confidence-bound UCB action selection. This method is a bit more sophisticated than greedy.
Okay.
Instead of just exploring randomly, UCB intelligently selects non-greedy actions by considering two things simultaneously: how close an action's current estimated value is to being the best, and the uncertainty in that estimate. The formula looks something like argmaxa QTA plus C score key LNT, NTA.
Whoa, okay, break that down.
Sure. QTA is the current estimated value of action A. The second term is the uncertainty bonus. NTA increases slowly with the number of total pulls T. NTA is the number of times action A has been pulled so far. So if an action hasn't been pulled very often, NTA is small, the uncertainty term becomes large, making that action more attractive to select, even if its current estimate QTA isn't the highest.
Ah, so it explicitly encourages trying actions you're less certain about.
Exactly. It subtly favors actions that have high potential to be the actual best, given the current data, by balancing their estimated value with how much more you could learn about them. It's a more targeted and often more efficient form of exploration than random greedy exploration.
That sounds like a very rational way to approach it. It prioritizes learning where it's most needed. And is there a method that shifts away from estimating values directly?
Yes, there are gradient bandits. This method takes a different tack. Instead of directly estimating reward values QTA, it learns a numerical preference HTA for each action.
A preference, not a value.
Right. These preferences don't necessarily correspond to expected rewards. Higher preferences just make an action more likely to be chosen. These preferences are then converted into action probabilities using a softmax distribution, like the Boltzmann distribution. Actions with higher preferences get higher probabilities. The update rule adjusts the preferences based on the received reward compared to a baseline, typically the average reward seen so far. If an action leads to a reward higher than the baseline, its preference increases. If lower, it decreases.
And why the baseline?
What's particularly useful here is that reward baseline term. It helps the algorithm adapt quickly to overall shifts in the reward landscape. For example, if all rewards suddenly increase by 4, the gradient bandit algorithm, using this baseline, wouldn't be affected much because it focuses on the relative preferences rather than absolute values. This makes it robust to constant reward offsets.
Okay, that makes sense. This idea of a simple bandit problem where you're just picking the best option is a great introduction. But this expands into something much closer to the full reinforcement learning problem we're ultimately interested in, right? How do we make that leap from simple choice to dynamic interaction?
That leap is made with associative search tasks, which are often also called contextual bandits in the literature.
Contextual bandits. Okay.
The n-armed bandit problem, as we've discussed it, assumes the situation is always the same. You just have that row of identical-looking slot machines. But what if the bandit task changes depending on the situation, and you get a clue about which task you're facing? For example, what if the slot machine's display changes color each time you approach it, and the color tells you something about which lever is likely to be best for that color?
Ah, so the state provides context.
Exactly. Now, you're not just trying to find the single best action overall, but rather the best action for a given situation or context. Say, if the machine is red, pull lever 1. If it's green, pull lever 2. This is what associative search is about. Associating specific actions with specific situations or states. This forms a crucial bridge between the simple, non-associative bandit problem, where there's only one state, and the full complexity of reinforcement learning. In full RL, actions not only lead to immediate rewards, but they also influence the next situation or state you find yourself in. This sequential aspect, where actions affect future states, is what really defines the full RL problem, moving beyond just bandits.
So, the bandit problem helps us understand how to choose the best option now while balancing exploration. But what if your choice also changes the next set of options you have? That's where things get truly dynamic. And that brings us to Markov decision processes, or MDPs. You mentioned them briefly before. This seems like the framework to formalize that dynamic sequential interaction between an agent and its environment over time.
You got it. MDPs provide a rigorous mathematical specification for the full reinforcement learning problem, capturing that state-action-reward next state cycle. Let's break down this fundamental agent-environment interface again now in the MDP context. At each discrete time step t, the agent observes the environment's current state. Based on this state, it chooses an action from the set of actions available to it in that particular state. Let's call it ascent.
Right, actions might depend on the state.
Exactly. One time step later is a direct consequence of its action. At taken in state saint, the agent receives a numerical reward, RT plus 1, and transitions to a new state, saint plus 1. This cycle of observation, saint, action, reward, RT plus 1, and new state, saint plus 1, continues, forming the trajectory of interaction.
And the probabilities of ending up in a certain state, saint plus 1, with reward RT plus 1, given saint and at, define the environment's dynamics.
Precisely. The function PSA-RSA defines the probability of transitioning to state S's and receiving reward R, given that you were in state S and took action A. This captures the dynamics of the environment. And a key insight here, which the book emphasizes, is the boundary between agent and environment. Anything the agent cannot arbitrarily change is considered part of its environment.
Even if the agent knows the rules perfectly, like for a Rubik's Cube.
Exactly. Even if the agent knows all the rules of the Rubik's Cube, the environment's dynamics, the cube itself, its current configuration, is part of the environment. The boundary is about control, not necessarily about knowledge or complexity inside the agent.
That's a useful distinction. Control defines the boundary. So if the agent's goal is to maximize reward, and the reward is this powerful signal defining what to do, how exactly do we communicate to our learning agent what we want it to achieve in a way that it truly understands and pursues? You warned about unintended consequences earlier.
Yeah, it's not just possible. It's a very common pitfall in designing RL systems. The reward signal is absolutely paramount, It's the single most important definition of the problem we're trying to solve. It's just a simple numerical value, a scalar, that the environment sends to the agent at each time step. The agent's sole objective, its entire purpose for existing in this framework, is to maximize the total cumulative reward it receives over the long run. This is known as the reward hypothesis, the idea that all of what we mean by goals and purposes can be framed as maximizing the expected cumulative sum of this scalar reward signal.
So everything boils down to that number sequence.
In this framework, yes. And it's absolutely critical to remember, as we discussed with the cleaning robot, that the reward signal defines what you want the agent to accomplish, not how you want it to achieve it. Reward an agent for winning a chess game, not just for capturing pieces, because capturing pieces might actually lead to losing the game. You must only reward it for achieving the ultimate goal. This prevents those unintended, often amusingly self-defeating suboptimal behaviors where the agent finds a loophole in your reward definition.
Maximizing total rewards sounds straightforward enough, but it gets tricky depending on the nature of the task. You mentioned this earlier. Are we talking about a game with a clear end or a continuous process? How does that impact how we measure total reward?
Exactly. The goal is maximizing cumulative reward. But how we define that sum depends on the task structure. We define the return, GT, as the specific function of the sequence of future rewards that the agent seeks to maximize, starting from time step T. For episodic tasks, there's a natural final time step T. Think of playing a single game of chess, a maze navigation task, or one trip of the recycling robot. Each instance is an episode that eventually ends in a special terminal state, after which the environment might reset for a new episode.
Like finishing a game.
Right. In this case, the return G is simply the sum of all rewards received from time T plus 1 until the episode concludes at time. TGT equals RT plus 1 plus RT plus 2 plus RT.
Simple sum.
Okay. However, for continuing tasks, the interaction doesn't break down into distinct episodes. It just goes on and on, potentially forever, meaning T resent. Think of a long-lived robot managing a chemical process or an algorithm controlling power grid stability.
Where there's no natural game over.
Exactly. Here, a simple sum of rewards could easily become infinite, making it impossible to compare different policies or maximize the value. To address this, we introduce a discount rate, corn gamma. This is a value between 0 and 1, usually close to 1, like 0.9 or 0.99. The return GT is then defined as the discounted sum. GT equals RT plus 1 plus dude plus 2 plus 3 plus 3 plus care. So future rewards are worth less than immediate rewards.
Precisely. A reward received K steps in the future is only worth Go times what it would be worth if received immediately. This mathematical trick ensures that the sum of an infinite sequence of rewards, as long as they are bounded, remains finite. It also makes intuitive sense. Often we do care more about immediate rewards. It encourages the agent to prioritize reasonably near-term rewards while still considering the long-term future.
And go close to 1 means it's very patient. Close to 0 means it's very short-sighted. Exactly right. And our source even mentions a clever theoretical trick. We can unify both episodic and continuing tasks mathematically by defining episode termination as transitioning to a special absorbing state that only produces 0 rewards forever. This allows us to use the discounted framework for all tasks, simplifying the notation in theory.
The idea of state is absolutely crucial in an MDP. It's the agent's window into the world, telling it what's happening right now, what makes a good state signal, and what does it mean for a state to have the Markov property. That sounds important.
It is fundamental to the whole MDP framework. Ideally, a state signal state should possess the Markov property. This means that the future is independent of the past, given the present state. More formally, the probability of the next state saying plus 1 and reward work plus 1 depends only on the current state saying and the current action at, and not on any previous state's actions or rewards, S0, A0, ST1, at 1.
So the current state captures everything relevant from the past.
Exactly. It should compactly summarize all relevant past information needed to predict the immediate future. Think about that chess position again. The current board setup is the state. You don't need to know the history of moves that led to it to decide the best next move. The current configuration contains all the information relevant to future possibilities according to the rules of chess.
Or the cannonball example.
Right. For a cannonball's flight, its current position and velocity vector constitute a Markov state. How it got to those specific position and velocity values is irrelevant for predicting where it will be next. Only the current values matter according to the laws of physics. The state is a sufficient statistic of the past.
That makes perfect sense for highly structured things like chess or physics problems. But in the messy real world, does a perfect Markov state even exist often? It sounds like it could quickly become overwhelming, needing to include almost everything.
That's the practical challenge. Our source wisely points out that perfect Markov states are actually quite rare in complex real-world scenarios. Think about that poker game example again.
Right, needing player history.
Exactly. A truly Markov state might need to include not just your cards in the community cards, but maybe the betting patterns, the estimated hand ranges, psychological tells, and even the history of how these specific players have played against you in the past. That's an impossibly vast amount of information to capture perfectly.
So what do we do in practice?
Fortunately, agents can often make very good decisions even with state representations that are not perfectly Markov, as long as they are nearly Markov or capture most of the relevant information. Sometimes we have to approximate the state. In fact, the book notes that sometimes using a coarser, technically non-Markov state representation can even facilitate learning by forcing the agent to generalize and ignore fine, irrelevant details.
Yeah.
Like in early pole balancing tasks, where just knowing if the cart was roughly left, middle, or right worked better than using precise coordinates because it encouraged broader generalization.
Interesting. So good enough might be better than perfect, but unusable.
Often, yes. It's about finding a state representation that balances predictive power with learnability and generalizability.
Let's make this concrete with an example right out of our source material, the recycling robot. This really helps illustrate how all these MDP components, states, actions, rewards, dynamics fit together.
Yes, the recycling robot is a classic simple example of a finite MDP. Let's revisit it. The robot's decision-making is solely based on its energy level. It has just two possible states, high energy or low energy. Let's call them S high and S low. The robot's possible actions depend on its state. If its energy is high, it can choose to search for cans or just wait. If its energy is low, it has three choices: search, wait, or recharge its battery.
So A high, search, wait, and A
What's a
low.
recharge? Exactly. The environment's dynamics, the PSRSA function, are defined by probabilities and rewards. For instance, if the robot is in state high and chooses search, maybe it stays high with probability and gets a reward search, but drops to low with probability 1 now, also getting reward search. If it's low and chooses search, maybe it stays low with probability below getting a search, but runs out of battery completely with probability 1 no. Requiring rescue, state remains low, but gets a large negative reward, say maybe a 3, and maybe it finds a can for search. If it's low and chooses recharge, it deterministically transitions to high in the next step, maybe getting a reward of 0 for that action.
And waiting might have its own transition probabilities and rewards.
Right. Maybe waiting while high keeps it high and gives a small reward weight, while waiting while low keeps it low and gives a weight. The crucial aspect is that these states, actions, the probabilities of transitioning between states given an action, and the associated rewards received during those transitions are all defined and interconnected. This fully specifies the problem as a finite MDP, laying the groundwork for figuring out the best policy, the best sequence of decisions for the robot to maximize its long-term can collection or reward.
We've talked about states and actions, the MDP framework, and the agent's ultimate goal of maximizing cumulative reward. But how does the agent actually figure out what the best action is in any given state? It needs some way to estimate how good it is to be in a certain situation or how good it is to take a certain action from that situation. This estimation seems absolutely central to reinforcement learning, and you mentioned it's the job of value functions.
You've hit on a critical point. Value functions are indeed central to almost all RL algorithms. They are essentially functions that, for a given state or a given state-action pair, estimate how good that state or action is in terms of the expected future, returns the expected cumulative discounted reward from that point onwards.
So they look ahead, not just at the immediate reward.
Exactly. They're about the long-term potential. Now, this goodness isn't some absolute measure. It's always defined with respect to a particular way of behaving, a specific policy denoted by a p-pi.
Why dependent on the policy?
Because the actions an agent takes are determined by its policy. It tells it which action to choose in state S. And those actions directly influence the future states it encounters and the rewards it receives. So the value of being in a state can change dramatically depending on whether the agent is following a cautious policy, an aggressive policy, a random policy, or hopefully an optimal policy.
Okay, that makes sense. The value depends on how you plan to act from that point on. So if we want to measure this goodness, this expected future return under a policy, What are the main ways we typically quantify it? What are the key types of value functions?
There are two key types of value functions we focus on. First, there's the state value function, usually denoted V. This tells you the expected return, the expected cumulative discounted future reward if you start in a specific state S and then follow policy indefinitely from that point forward. It's an assessment of how good it is simply to be in state S, assuming you stick to policy.
V for value, pi for policy, S for state. Got it. V for value.
Right. Second, we have the action value function, usually denoted QBS. This function estimates the expected return if you start in state S, take a specific action at first, and then follow policy indefinitely thereafter.
Q for quality, or just the next letter.
Well, Q is often used for action values. Think of it as the value of the state-action pair. This QS function is often more directly useful for decision-making, because if you know the Q value for all possible actions that you could take in state S, you could just pick the action with the highest Q value to act greedily according to policy.
Oh, okay. So Q directly tells you about the consequence of taking a specific action now.
Exactly. And both V and Q can, in principle, be estimated directly from experience. For example, if an agent follows policy for many episodes and it keeps track of all the actual returns GT it received after visiting state S, it could just average those returns. That average will, over time, converge to the true state value VS.
And similarly for Q values, average the returns after taking action A in state S.
Precisely. Those are what we call Monte Carlo methods for estimating value functions, learning from completed episodes by averaging sample returns.
If the agent is trying to maximize reward, there must be an ultimate best way to do things, right? A sort of North Star for our policies and value functions to aspire to. An optimal policy.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal in many RL problems is to find an optimal policy, denoted pi star. An optimal policy is defined as a policy that achieves expected returns greater than or equal to all other possible policies for every single state S. So
Better than
or equal to everything else, everywhere.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that while there might be multiple different policies that are all optimal, achieving the same maximum return, they all share the same optimal state value function, and the same optimal action value function, QVAS, gives the maximum possible expected return starting from state S, achievable by any policy. And QSA gives the maximum possible expected return starting from state S, taking action A, and then following an optimal policy thereafter. So V and Q represent the true upper limit of performance.
Yes, and these optimal value functions satisfy a critical mathematical relationship called the Bellman optimality equation. This is really the heart of much of reinforcement learning theory and algorithms.
Bellman optimality equation, that sounds like a big deal. Can you give us the intuition behind it without diving too deep into the math right away? What does its structure really mean for optimal decision making?
It truly is a big deal. Intuitively, the Bellman optimality equation expresses a fundamental truth about optimal decision-making. The value of being in an optimal state, or taking an optimal action from a state, must equal the expected return you get by choosing the best possible action from that state and then acting optimally thereafter. It enforces a self-consistency condition for optimality. It's like saying, the best possible long-term outcome from where I am right now must be achieved by picking the single best immediate action available to me, considering the immediate reward plus the discounted optimal value of the state that action leads to, and then acting optimally from S onwards.
So it connects the value of a state to the values of its possible successor states through the best action.
Exactly. Mathematically, the Bellman optimality equation for V looks like this. VS, maxic ER plus 1 plus over census plus 1 STS, BS. Or expanding the expectation using the environment dynamics, BSA, ES, maxo, BSO, BSA, SAE. It says the optimal value of state S is found by looking one step ahead. Consider every possible action A, calculate the expected return, immediate reward R plus discounted optimal value of the next state S, average this over all possible outcomes S and R for that action, and then pick the action A that maximizes this one step ahead expectation.
And there's a similar equation for Q.
Yes, the Bellman optimality equation for Q is QSA ER plus 1 plus BAS QSA KSA QSA R plus gas. This is the optimal value of taking action in state S is the expected immediate reward R plus the discounted value of the best possible action you can take from the next state.
That's a powerful idea. This perfect recursive consistency, perfect foresight, and decision-making at every step. It sounds like if we could just solve the Bellman optimality equation for V or Q, we'd have the optimal policy and all the answers for any RL problem. Why can't we just do that for everything?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where the reality check comes in. In practice, finding truly optimal policies by exactly solving the Bellman optimality equation is rarely feasible for interesting, complex tasks.
Why not? What's the bottleneck?
For most real-world problems, the computational cost is just extreme, as the book puts it. There are three main hurdles. First, you need a perfect model of the environment dynamics, PS, RS Weep, which you often don't have. Second, the number of states can be enormous. Even for games like chess or Go, the number of possible board states is astronomical, far beyond what we can explicitly store or compute values for. Third, even if you had the model and could store the states, solving the system of equations defined by the Bellman optimality equation, which can be nonlinear due to the max operator, can be computationally very intensive.
So perfect optimality is usually out of reach.
Usually, yes. Even for chess, large, custom-designed computers can't compute the truly optimal move from every possible board state by solving the Bellman equation. The search space is too vast. Therefore, RL agents must often settle for approximating optimality. We try to find policies and value functions that are close to optimal or good enough for the task at hand.
How do we approximate?
Well, for problems with relatively small, finite state sets, what we call the tabular case, we can sometimes find optimal solutions or near optimal ones using methods like dynamic programming, if we have the model, or the TD methods we'll discuss next. In the tabular case, we can literally store the estimated values, V's or Q's, in arrays or tables with one entry for each state or state action pair.
Okay, so tables work for small problems.
Right. But for the vast majority of real-world problems, think robotics with continuous joint angles, self-driving cars with complex sensor inputs, or games like backgammon, or go with maybe 10, 20, or 10 and 90 states, the state space is simply too huge for a table. It's infinite or practically infinite.
So what do we do then?
Here, we absolutely must use function approximation. Instead of a table storing a separate value for each state, we use a more compact parameterized function like a linear function, or more commonly these days, an artificial neural network to represent the value functions. Let's say V, SW, or QS, IDU, where W is a vector of parameters or weights.
So the function takes the state and maybe action as input and outputs an estimated value using a relatively small set of weights W.
Exactly. The beauty of this approach is that the number of weights W can be much, much smaller than the number of states. And crucially, adjusting just one parameter in W based on experience in one state can generalize and affect the estimated values of many other similar states. This generalization is key to making learning feasible and efficient for these large, complex problems.
Okay, so we need ways to learn approximate value functions, especially for large problems. We've seen Monte Carlo methods, which learn from full episodes after they conclude by averaging actual returns. They don't need a model, which is good. And we mentioned dynamic programming, which can solve the Bellman equations but needs a complete model of the environment. What if we could combine the strengths of both? Learn directly from experience like Monte Carlo, but also update our estimates much more frequently without waiting for an episode to end, maybe using some ideas from dynamic programming.
You've just described one of the truly core and novel ideas central to reinforcement learning, temporal difference, TD learning. It is precisely that combination you're talking about. It's arguably the most foundational concept unique to RL. Like Monte Carlo methods, TD methods can learn directly from raw experience. They don't need a full mathematical model of the environment's dynamics, EJs. That's a huge advantage. But critically, like dynamic programming, TD methods bootstrap.
Bootstrap, what does that mean here?
It means they update their estimates based in part on other learned estimates, rather than waiting for a final outcome, like Monte Carlo, or needing a full model sweep, like DP. They learn a guess from a guess. This crucial ability allows for continuous online learning, updating estimates at every single time step, making it incredibly powerful, especially for continuing tasks that don't have natural endpoints, or very long episodic tasks where waiting for the end is impractical.
Learning a guess from a guess. Okay, that sounds potentially powerful, but maybe a bit circular. How exactly does this bootstrapping work in its simplest form? How can we update our estimate for a state's value without waiting for the full story, the final return, to unfold?
The simplest and most fundamental TD method is called TD0, or one-step TD. Think of it this way. Your current estimate for the value of a state, let's call it VS, gets adjusted based on how surprised you are by what actually happens in the very next step. Specifically, you observe the immediate reward RT plus 1 and the next state SAM plus 1. You then use your current estimate of the value of that next state, VSAM plus 1, to form a target for what VS should have been, RT plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. This target is a sample of the value of, say, bootstrapping off the estimate V Saint plus 1.
So the target uses the actual immediate reward plus the estimated value of where you landed?
Exactly. The difference between this target and your current estimate V Saint is your surprise, or, more formally, the TD error, often denoted delta TD. A Saint plus 1 plus TD Saint plus 1 V is then updates the estimate for the state you just left, V Saint slain, by moving it slightly in the direction of this target, controlled by a step-size parameter, ideal have fan flaint, V Saint Mosey V Saint plus RD plus 1 plus Sodia Saint plus 1 fleet.
Ah, okay. So you're nudging your current estimate based on the immediate reward and your estimate of the future without waiting for the actual full future return.
Precisely. This sample backup, updating based on a single sample transition, Saint at RT plus 1, Saint plus 1, and the estimated value of the successor state, Saint plus 1, is the key distinction from DP's full backups, which would average over all possible next states and rewards, according to the Model P. TD learns directly from experience, one step at a time.
That still sounds a bit technical, even with the surprise analogy. Can you give us an everyday example to really cement this idea of learning from the very next moment, rather than waiting for the whole episode to play out? The driving home example, maybe.
Yes, our source offers that perfect analogy, predicting your driving time home from work. It beautifully illustrates the difference between TD and Monte Carlo. Let's say you leave the office and initially estimate, based on past experience maybe, that it will take 30 minutes to get home. So, V leaving office, 30. 5 minutes later, you're on the usual route, but suddenly it starts raining heavily. You don't wait until you're actually home to revise your initial 30-minute estimate. Instead, you immediately think, okay, it's raining now, traffic will be worse, it'll probably take me 35 minutes from this point. Your new estimate for the total trip is now 5 minutes, already driven, plus 35 minutes, new estimate equals 40 minutes.
Right, you update based on the new info and your revised future prediction.
Exactly. A TD method does something similar. When you observe the reward, 5 minutes elapsed time, and the next state, being on the route in heavy rain, and you form a new estimate of the remaining time, 35 minutes, you can immediately update your original estimate for V leaving office. You use the TD error. The target is 5 minutes elapsed plus 35 minutes estimated remaining equals 40 minutes. Your original estimate was 40 minutes. The error is 40/30 equals 10 minutes. You adjust V leaving office upwards.
Okay, so you learn about the start of the trip based on what happened just a few minutes in.
Yes. Now contrast that with a Monte Carlo method. It would wait until you actually get home. Let's say the total trip took 43 minutes because you also got stuck behind a slow truck later.
Oh.
Only then would the Monte Carlo method update the initial 30-minute estimate for V leaving office using the actual final return, 43 minutes. It learns only from completed experiences.
So TD learns online, step by step, while Monte Carlo learns offline at the end of the episode.
Precisely. This online, step-by-step learning of TD is incredibly powerful, especially when tasks are very long. Imagine estimating the time for a cross-country drive, or don't have clear endpoints, continuing tasks. It's about learning mid-journey, constantly recalibrating your mental map based on immediate feedback and future estimates. That's a huge leap from just reviewing the whole trip afterwards, right? It means you can adapt much faster. Empirical studies like those on simple random walk grid world tasks in the book consistently show that TD Therapy often converges faster and more efficiently to the true values than Monte Carlo methods on stochastic tasks.
That's a really clear distinction. So TD learning helps us predict values much more efficiently. But our ultimate goal in reinforcement learning is usually to control an agent, to make it act optimally. How do we use these TD updates to actually learn a good policy, to make good decisions, not just predict values?
That's where we extend the idea of generalized policy iteration, GPI, which we touched on briefly with dynamo programming. Remember GPI. It's this general concept of letting two interacting processes work together. One, policy evaluation, estimating the value function, V or Q, for the current policy. Two, policy improvement, making the policy greedy or A greedy with respect to the current value function estimates. These two processes continually chase each other, ideally converging towards an optimal policy and optimal value function. TD methods can be plugged into the policy evaluation part of this loop to create powerful control algorithms that learn policies directly from experience.
Okay, so we use TDD to estimate the values and then use those estimates to improve the policy. What are some key TD-controlled algorithms?
Let's look at two prominent examples that highlight a critical difference: on-policy versus off-policy learning. First, there's SARSA. The name is an acronym that comes directly from the sequence of events involved in its update. State, Saint, action at, reward, RT plus 1, next state, Saint plus 1, next action at plus 1.
SARSK.
Got it. SARSA is an on-policy TD control algorithm. What on-policy means is that SARSA learns the action value function, QS, for the policy it is currently following, including any exploration that policy might be doing, like greedy exploration. Its update rule looks like this. QS add statement as QS statement add +1 +1 +8 plasma +1 at +1 at +1 QS as pinta.
So the target arc +1 will so QS cos1 at +1 uses the key value of the action at +1 that the current policy actually chose in the next state.
Exactly. It learns the value of acting according to its current behavior policy. SARS is guaranteed to converge to an optimal policy and action value function under certain conditions, like visiting all state action pairs infinitely often and gradually reducing exploration, making the policy eventually greedy. Think of the windy grid world example from the book. An agent navigates a grid where an upward wind pushes it off course on some columns. SARSA, being on policy, learns a safe path that might take longer, but reliably avoids getting blown into penalties frequently, because it directly experiences and learns about the consequences of its current exploratory actions near the windy areas.
Okay, so SARSA is learning the value of the actions it's actually taking, including its exploratory mistakes or deviations. What's the alternative to that, and how does it differ?
The main alternative is Q-learning, developed by Chris Watkins. Q-learning is a seminal off-policy TD control algorithm.
Off policy, so it learns about a policy different from the one it's using to generate actions.
Precisely. Q-learning learns the optimal action value function Q or Q directly, regardless of the policy the agent is actually following for exploration, as long as the exploration policy visits all state action pairs sufficiently. Its update rule is subtly different but fundamentally important. QS8, ADT, QSC, ADST, ND +1 plus co back C +1 AD. Look at the target. RT +1 plus co ST +1. Instead of using QST +1 at +1, like SARSA, it uses the maximum Q value over all possible next actions in the next state, AG +1.
Exactly. It uses the estimated value of the best action it could take from the next state, according to its current estimates, not the value of the action, at +1 that its behavior policy might have actually chosen. This allows Q-learning to learn about the optimal greedy policy, even while it might be behaving non-optimally, exploring randomly, to gather experience. That's a fundamental distinction. So if SARSA learns about the policy it's actually doing, the behavior policy, and Q-learning learns about the optimal policy, the target policy, no matter what it's doing, when would you choose one over the other? Are there trade-offs?
Absolutely. There are clear trade-offs, beautifully illustrated by the cliff-walking grid world example in the source. Imagine an agent trying to get from a start location S to a goal location G across a grid. There's a safe path across the top, but along the bottom edge, there's a cliff. Falling off the cliff gives a huge negative reward, -100, and sends the agent back to the start. Every other step gives a reward of -1.
Okay, so you want the shortest path, but definitely avoid the cliff.
Right. Now, the truly shortest path runs right along the edge of the cliff. SARSA, being on policy and using a greedy exploration, learns a safe path further away from the cliff edge. Why? Because during its exploration, its O-greedy policy will occasionally take a random action downwards when near the edge, causing it to fall off the cliff. Since SARSA learns from its actual experience, including those costly falls generated by its own policy, it incorporates that risk into its learned action values and finds a policy that avoids the edge.
It learns to be cautious because its own exploration is dangerous near the cliff.
Exactly. Q-learning, being off policy, learns the truly optimal but risky path that skims right along the edge of the cliff. Why? Because when it calculates the TD target using max Q +1 run, it considers the value assuming the best action, moving along the edge, will be taken from the next state, regardless of whether its A-greedy behavior policy might occasionally cause it to step off the cliff during exploration. It learns the value of the greedy policy directly.
So Q-learning finds the theoretically best path, assuming perfect execution later, while SARSA finds a path that's safer, given the current level of exploration.
That's a great summary. Q-learning often converges to the optimal policy faster, but can be less stable during learning, especially with function approximation. SARSA might learn slower or converge to a safer, potentially suboptimal policy if exploration persists, but it can be more stable because it's learning about the policy it's actually executing.
That really clarifies the on-policy versus off-policy difference. Now, you mentioned something earlier about after-states in tic-tac-toe when discussing historical roots. This sounds like a useful trick for certain types of problems to make learning more efficient. Can you elaborate on what an after-state is and why it helps?
Yes. After states are a clever optimization. particularly useful in tasks where you know the immediate deterministic outcome of your action before any further environmental stochasticity or other agents' actions come into play. A classic example is deterministic board games like tic-tac-toe or even parts of backgammon before the dice roll. When you make a move in tic-tac-toe, you know exactly what the board looks like after your move, but before your opponent makes their move. An afterstate is precisely this intermediate state, the state after your action before the environment's full response, for example, the opponent's move.
So it's the state resulting purely from my action.
Right. Learning value functions over these afterstates, let's call it V afterstate, is often much more efficient than learning conventional state action values Q.
Why is that more efficient?
Because many different conventional state action pairs can lead to the exact same afterstate. For instance, in tic-tac-toe, reaching a certain board configuration with your X just placed might have been possible from several different preceding board states by taking the appropriate action A. If you learn the value of the afterstate itself, any learning update based on reaching that afterstate immediately benefits the evaluation of all the state action pairs that could have led there.
Ah, so it provides better generalization across equivalent situations.
Exactly. It significantly reduces the number of distinct entities the agent needs to learn values for, leading to much faster and more sample-efficient learning, especially in domains with symmetries or redundant state action representations.
Okay, so TD0 looks one step ahead using bootstrapping. Monte Carlo looks all the way to the end of the episode using actual returns. Is there a way to blend these? To look somewhere in between or even average across multiple look-ahead horizons, maybe getting the best of both worlds, combining immediate feedback with longer-term outcomes more flexibly.
Indeed. This is where the powerful and elegant concepts of eligibility traces and TD lambda come into play, providing a sophisticated mechanism to seamlessly bridge the gap between one-step TD methods like TD0 and full Monte Carlo methods. First, let's consider a simpler stepping stone: in-step TD methods. Instead of just looking one step ahead for the TD target, RT plus 1 was my 2 plus 1, you can look n steps ahead. The n-step target would be the sum of rewards over n steps, plus the discounted value of the state reached n steps later. RT plus 1 plus order plus 2 plus box apples plus NRT plus n plus n VST plus n.
So use n steps of actual rewards and then bootstrap off the value estimate n steps later.
Exactly. This creates a spectrum of methods. One-step TD is TD0. If n extends all the way to the end of the episode, the n-step return becomes the full Monte Carlo return, RT plus 1 plus DT, DT1RT, as the final VST term is often defined as 0. Intermediate values of n can often provide a good balance between the bias of TD0, due to bootstrapping off potentially inaccurate estimates, and the variance of Monte Carlo, due to relying on long sequences of random outcomes.
Okay, so n-step gives us a range. How does TD fit in?
Now, TD-Go, using what we call the forward view for conceptual understanding, takes this idea even further. Instead of picking just one n, the return good is defined as an average of all possible n-step returns, from the one-step return up to the full Monte Carlo return. It's a weighted average, where the weight given to each n-step return decreases exponentially with n, controlled by a parameter lambda, where 0 1. Specifically, the weight for the n-step return is proportional to n1.
So it combines information from all timescales?
Yes. If in D0, all the weight falls on the one-step return, so TD0 is recovered. If in E0, it can be shown that the weights effectively average to give the Monte Carlo return, though there are subtleties with infinite horizons. Intermediate values of EAN allow the agent to gracefully balance immediate feedback, like TD0, with longer-term consequences, like Monte Carlo. This often leads to significantly faster learning than either extreme, as demonstrated empirically in the random walk example in the book, where intermediate values typically perform best.
That's a beautiful theoretical idea, averaging across all possible future horizons weighted by lambda. But actually calculating that return seems impossible in practice, right? You'd need to wait until the end of the episode to compute all the n-step returns needed for the average.
You've hit on the practical challenge. The forward view, based on the L return, is great for understanding the goal, but it's non-causal and not practical for real-time online implementation because it needs to see into the future. That's where the brilliant backward view of TD comes in. It provides a purely mechanistic, computationally feasible, and causal way to approximate the forward view incrementally, step by step. It introduces the concept of eligibility traces.
Eligibility traces. Okay,
Yes.
What are they?
An eligibility trace is essentially a short-term memory variable associated with each state, for V, or state action pair, for Q. Let's denote the trace for state S at time as ETS. At each step, the trace for the currently visited state saint is incremented. age equal by 1. Then, over time, the traces for all states decay exponentially at a rate determined by gamma times lambda.
Yeah.
So, eat ES, it's come 1 for states SA saint and eat saint gamma times lambda.
So traces mark which states have been visited recently, with the mark fading over time?
Exactly. Now, when a TD error equals RT kit plus 1 plus V saint plus 1 V has occurs at time dt, this single error signal is used to update the value estimate Vs for every state S proportionally to that state's current eligibility trace ETS V saint develops ES plus RDES for all S.
Whoa! So the error gets shouted back to all recently visited states.
Precisely. States visited more recently, higher trace value, or those visited when EOT is higher, slower trace decay, receive a larger share of the credit or blame for the current TD error. This provides a powerful and efficient mechanism for distributing credit for a reward or penalty across the entire sequence of states and actions that led to it.
That makes intuitive sense for credit assignment. Like, in that grid world, SARSA would strengthen not just the very last action leading to a reward, but many actions in the path leading up to it, with the strength fading the further back in time they occurred.
Exactly right. It elegantly connects delayed outcomes back to the preceding sequence of states' actions. And naturally, these eligibility trace mechanisms are then extended to the control algorithms. SARSA and Q utilize eligibility traces, now associated with state action pairs, to accelerate the learning of action values. Watkins Q, developed by Watkins himself, has a unique twist compared to SARSA. It cuts eligibility traces back to 0 whenever an exploratory, non-greedy action is taken. This focuses the learning more directly on the consequences of following the greedy policy.
Fascinating. Eligibility traces seem like a really powerful tool for learning from delayed rewards. Finally, let's tie this all back to what we discussed about tackling problems with massive state spaces, where simple tables just won't cut it. How do we apply these sophisticated TD learning methods, maybe even with eligibility traces, in those massive real-world scenarios using function approximation?
This is where the real power comes in, combining the efficient learning mechanisms of TD methods, especially TD, with the scalability of function approximation.
Whoa.
As we discussed, instead of trying to tabulate a value Vs or Qes for every single state, which is impossible for large problems, we use parameterized functions, often linear functions or neural networks, to estimate these values. Vs, W, or Q, A, where W is the vector of adjustable parameters or weights.
So how do we update the weights at W using TD errors?
We use gradient descent methods. The goal is to adjust the weights W in a direction that reduces the error between our current function's estimate V saint W and a TD target, like the TD0 target Christ RT plus 1 plus Lausanne plus 1 W, or an end-step target, or a return target. We calculate the gradient of the squared error with respect to the weights W and update the weights in the opposite direction of the gradient. For the simplest case of TD0 with state values, the update rule becomes WT plus 1 plus also RT plus 1 plus saint plus 1 find W V saint W. Where was dV V saint W is the gradient of the value function estimate with respect to the weights, evaluated at the current state saint.
Okay, so we need the gradient of our function approximator. And can we combine this with eligibility traces?
Yes, absolutely. The combination is very powerful. When using eligibility traces with function approximation, the trace A becomes a vector of the same size as the weight vector W. It accumulates the gradients, W to AD A day, saint W, over time, also decaying by gay. The update rule then becomes beautifully simple. W2 plus 1 plus WT plus saint W. Here is the standard one-step TD error calculated using the current estimates, saint plus 1 saint W, and A is the vector of eligibility traces for the weights. This update rule effectively applies the current TD error back through time to update the weights based on recently encountered state features, weighted by IC.
And what kind of function approximators are common? You mentioned linear functions and neural networks.
Right. A common and very well understood approach is linear function approximation. Here, the value function is simply a linear combination of features extracted from the state S. The state S is first mapped to a feature vector X's, and the value is VSWWTX's.
So the weights W just scale the importance of different features.
Exactly. In this case, the gradient EdgeW VSW is simply the feature vector X's itself, which makes the updates very straightforward. The crucial part here is the choice of features, XS. Good features are essential for effective generalization.
What makes a feature good?
Good features capture the aspects of the state that are truly relevant for predicting value. Several techniques exist for creating features. Coarse coding uses overlapping receptive fields. Imagine features that activate if a state variable falls within a certain range, but these ranges overlap. If a state falls into the overlap region, it activates multiple features. Learning about that state will then automatically generalize to other states that share some, but maybe not all, of those same active features.
Tile coding. The book highlights this as a very practical and computationally efficient form of coarse coding, especially for multidimensional continuous states. The input space is divided into multiple overlapping tilings, or grids, offset from each other. Each tile within a tiling corresponds to a binary feature, either active or inactive. The multiple tilings ensure that any given state activates exactly one tile in each tiling, leading to a fixed number of active features. This makes the step size parameter intuitive to set and guarantees good generalization properties. Tile coding sounds useful for continuous problems. Any examples?
Yes, the mountain car task is a classic benchmark problem described in the source. An underpowered car is stuck in a valley and needs to reach the hilltop goal. It can't drive straight up. It has to learn to drive backwards up the opposite slope first to build enough momentum to then drive forward and make it to the goal.
The classic get worse before you get better problem.
Exactly. SARSA, combined with tile coding to handle the continuous state of position and velocity, and optimistic initial values to encourage exploration, solves this brilliantly, as shown in the book. It demonstrates how these combined techniques, TD learning with eligibility traces and function approximation using well-designed features like tile coding, can handle continuous states and complex delayed reward problems.
And other types of features.
Another type mentioned is radial basis functions, RBFs. These are features whose activation depends on the distance of the state from some central point, often using a Gaussian shape. They provide smooth generalization and are often used for continuous variables. And of course, today, deep neural networks are frequently used as powerful nonlinear function approximators, learning complex feature representations directly from raw inputs like pixels in a game. This is the realm of deep reinforcement learning. But the core principles remain the same. Combining TD learning, often with eligibility trace ideas implicitly or explicitly, and function approximation, linear or nonlinear, allows RL agents to tackle truly complex, high-dimensional problems. The source highlights examples ranging from robotics, like the Acrobot, a two-link pendulum that needs to swing itself up, to managing real-world systems, like optimizing elevator dispatching in large buildings. #tag outro.
Wow, what a journey through the fascinating world of reinforcement learning. We really covered a lot of ground. From the simple yet profound idea of trial and error learning,
Yeah, going right back to Thorndike.
to the nuanced trade-off of exploration versus exploitation, which the multi-armed bandit problem just captures so perfectly.
That core dilemma.
Then through the formal mathematical specification of Markov decision processes, giving us the language of states, actions, rewards, and dynamics.
The bedrock framework.
And on to the critical role of value functions for estimating goodness. And finally, the real engine of learning in many cases, the elegance and power of temporal difference learning, especially with eligibility traces and function approximation.
It's amazing how these concepts build on each other.
It really is. We've seen how these fundamental concepts all fit together, forming the building blocks for agents that can learn truly intelligent decision-making strategies in complex, uncertain worlds.
What's truly fascinating here, and maybe something to ponder as we wrap up, is how many of these advanced RL techniques, things like balancing exploration and exploitation, or distributing credit for delayed rewards using eligibility traces, seem to mirror strategies we observe in biological learning systems, like animal brains, or even our own learning processes.
That's a really interesting point. The parallels between TD learning and dopamine signals in the brain, for instance.
Exactly. It raises a really important question. Are we, in developing these RL algorithms, merely building sophisticated tools that mimic intelligent behavior we see in nature? Or are we, perhaps, through these computational frameworks, actually uncovering the fundamental underlying computational principles of learning and intelligence itself?
That's a deep question. Are we engineering intelligence or discovering its blueprint?
Right. Think about how our own brains manage to assign credit for long-term goals, deciding to study hard now for a benefit years later. Or how we learn from experiences that have this complex mix of immediate feedback and very delayed outcomes. The algorithms we discussed today offer potential mechanisms for how such complex learning might actually work. The parallels are striking and I think deeply thought-provoking.
Absolutely. It gives you a whole new perspective on learning itself. There's always more to learn and explore in this rapidly evolving field, and we sincerely hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a fantastic and solid starting point for your own journey into the world of reinforcement learning.
Keep exploring those rewards.
Until next time on the deep dive, keep exploring.